Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome to our panel is the Super Age, Demographics, and Our Destiny. And I'm Suzanne Woolley with Bloomberg News, and with me is Bradley Schurman, who is a demographic strategist and author of a book called, aptly enough, The Super Age, Decoding Our Demographic Destiny. So to start, Bradley, I just wanted to talk about, what exactly is the super age? How are we there yet? What does it mean? How is it going to impact our lives, our businesses?
Right, some of us are already at the super age, which is a period in time, the first time in human history where at least 1 out of 5 people will be over the age of 65, the typical retirement age. In the United States, we're going to hit this period in roughly the next 5 years. As early as 2029, but as late as 2030. And just a few years after that, we're actually going to have more people over the age of 65 than under 18, which has never happened before, and it's kind of breaks the mind. But if you look across the United States now, you'll find states that already meet this definition. In fact, some counties, especially rural counties, you'll find places where at least 1 out of 3 people are over 65.
I think Maine is one that falls into the super age.
Maine is the first state that actually has hit the super age. And you can typically identify a super age state or a super age region by the way the workforce looks. So the jobs that we would typically assign to teenagers might actually be taken up by people well into their 60s or 70s. So it is a real mind bend to see this in actual action, but it's becoming a lot more normalized.
And what does, I've heard a lot of talk about the longevity economy, the longevity gap. What are the risks and rewards there? What are the opportunities and the challenges?
Yeah, so the longevity economy is actually a pretty massive thing. It's something that AARP defined a few years back as the economy of all people over the age of 50 in the United States. And it comes out to like $8.6, $8.9 trillion. It's huge. But the definition of it is a little squishy because there are basically 3 groups, and I think most of you will understand this. There are the people that are working, the 50 to 64s. There are people that are newly retired, 65 to let's say 74. And then there are people that are post-74, 75 plus, that are fully entrenched in their retirement. The 50 to 64s are super attractive, specifically to this group of people here, because they're still making big investments. They're running towards retirement. They want to make sure that they've got that nest egg and those investments really squared away at this point. So they're spending, and they're spending like crazy. The 65s to 74s, they're starting to draw a bit, but they're still spending at the same rate they did, if not higher than when they were working. The real kind of aha moment is that somehow, and we've been trying to figure this out for years, but right around that 75-year mark, people stop spending. They really put the brakes on. And they go into a period of effectively maintenance. They focus more spending on healthcare, for example.
Yeah, they're less mobile.
They're less mobile, but even those that are active, it's just an averaging of reality. And, my own family, my mother and father both turned 74 this past year, and they kind of put the brakes on. And they're high net worth. Shout out to Banking New York Mellon for taking care of their wealth. But they are starting to slow down a bit, despite trying to stay engaged.
What does it mean for the financial industry sort of writ large, having this older population? There is a lot of, the older population is the wealthier population with the big 401ks and such. What does it mean if I want to talk about sort of the younger generation, and where's the pipeline of clients going to come from, and what are they going to look like? You've got the older demographic there looking good, but what about your next wave?
Yeah, so I think everyone here is well aware of the great wealth transfer. It's pretty hard to avoid the subject these days, and it seems like the number keeps going up in terms of the total number of assets that are going to be passed from the boomers and older down to their children. I heard yesterday that the number is up to $124 trillion. That's roughly the global economy for a year. That's pretty astonishing. But when the money passes, it's passing to a generation that many wealth advisors may not have engaged with yet, especially in family wealth offices. So this creates a unique predicament, I think, for them if they haven't developed that relationship with the kids of the wealth holders who will effectively overnight become millionaires. And this is a generation that has struggled to buy houses, the millennials mostly, some late Gen X, but also really establish their footing on the financial ladder with making investments. Now, this kind of insecurity around investing and having money, Gen Z is very well aware of. And this is, I think, the biggest shift for this industry writ large, is that Gen Z is actually putting money into investments right now. But how they're doing it, I think, is in a very non-traditional way. They're not going necessarily to the big houses. They're not getting information directly from experts like all of you. They're going to TikTok. And people who purport to be really experts in the field, they may or may not be, but it's very hard to decipher, I think, for these young people who's actually giving good information. And a lot of it feels like a get-rich-quick scheme. Now, what's interesting about Gen Z in particular is that is their first point of contact for investment. The second point of contact tends to be their parents, their family members, and their last point today tends to be institutions. They are starting to go back into banks, back into financial services offices to get that last layer of input. In fact, most banks now are rethinking their entire customer banking experience because young people are actually making the return to retail banking to some degree. I haven't set foot in a bank in the past 2 years, outside of getting some paperwork done. But there is this signal now that young people are set to return.
Is there a communication issue between, if the bank is staffed by boomers and Gen Z is coming in, is there a sort of a communication style that...
Yeah, listen, there's always going to be a breakdown in communications between generations, and there's always going to be a bit of a breakdown between generations in the technology that we use. But I think that we know from past experience that the market doesn't necessarily meet us, we have to meet the market. So if the market of young people, these young investors that you want in your pipeline is showing up in places like TikTok, showing up in social media, they're getting their information from podcasts, which are being consumed at an absolutely astonishing rate by young people, that's where you need to be. And the tricky part for institutions is illustrating to these young people that you're providing really solid information in a way that they can trust and they feel is relevant to them, that isn't overly technical. And that's a pretty tough needle to thread. They're not necessarily going to pick up, the Bank of America podcast on building wealth, but they might pick up a podcast that's sponsored by Bank of America. So this is just an idea of how you think differently about getting to this cohort.
But also sort of communicating to this cohort. If you're in a business and you're needing to bring up younger advisors and connect, communication styles are different. So how might a boomer and a Gen Z sort of have a miscommunication? You told me a story a while ago about a friend of yours who had this...
I think you're finding now, most high knowledge industries are stressed right now when it comes to labor. Specifically, there aren't enough people to go around, especially financial services is one of these industries where you have a higher than average older population working in these industries. But when you've got, young people coming straight out of college at 22, older adults who stuck around, sometimes into their late 70s in these organizations, there are going to be natural breakdowns in communications. And a good friend of mine got this great job at 62. She started working, and within a week or two, she just really struggled because she wasn't getting responses back from her manager. And she tried and tried for months, finally reached out to me and said, "Hey, Brad, what do I do? I'm not getting a response from her. I don't think it's going to work." And I said, "Have you asked her how she's communicating?" And she said, "Well, no, I haven't." She goes, "I'm using email." Reached out to her boss, who is a millennial, mind you, and the millennial said, "Oh, I'm on Slack. I don't look at my email at all." So 9 times out of 10, these communication things are easily resolvable. But when you look at communication norms amongst generations, boomers are more likely to pick up the phone, they're more likely to walk down the hall, they're more likely to really develop that high-touch, in-person contact. Gen Z was not raised that way. They're the first truly digital generation. They're the first social media organization. In many ways, they have never developed that soft skill, although I think it's more of a hard skill, of being able to go down and actually speak to somebody face to face. So they struggle with that. What managers really need to focus on is how do we bridge that? How do we bridge that between these two generations? And it really is a two-way street amongst employees. So you should be encouraging your employees, if you're having these kind of challenges, to try different things. Because if these communications break down, your entire business unit breaks down as a result.
You had talked about how some companies are not even really wanting to hire Gen Zs.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, it's because of these communication issues. And I think to some degree because of the work ethic that they perceive Gen Z has. Now, most of us, I'm going to make an assessment here, are millennials and above in this group. Most of us have struggled to really had to fight to keep our jobs because there was a plethora of labor. There is not a plethora of labor around now. We all know recruitment, retention is tougher than ever. And that's largely because the birth rates have been off for about 20 or 30 years at this point. We have simply had fewer children. So just to give you a top line number here, there were 76 million baby boomers born in this country. There were only 69 million Gen Zs. So that alone is a 7 million person differential. So Gen Z was born into an economy that allowed them to be in high demand, and because of that, they are demanding more from their employers. We also have to remember that the first wave of Gen Z, in their formative years in the workplace, were told, you should work from home because there's a pandemic. So these young people are accustomed to flexibility in the workplace. They're accustomed to being able to work at their own pace and how they see fit, because for effectively, depending on where you lived in the country, anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 years, you weren't necessarily in an office setting. And that has fundamentally changed things because culture change starts to set in after 3 years. Clawing them back to what we consider to be a norm is really, I think, really a futile act until there is this loosening of labor again, where we can actually get people for cheaper and more people have to compete for work.
One thing I wanted to ask about was issues around succession for business owners.
Yeah.
Because if we're living longer, supposedly, I know you've talked about and written about in your book. We may be working longer. 65 may not be the goal anymore. We may need to work, God forbid, longer than that if we don't want to. So, I don't know, what is the, it seems like business owners may be in a conundrum here. Mm-hmm. Who do they sell to?
Well, I think that you've got kind of two questions here. The first question is, I'm a large multinational corporation. How do I do succession planning with my employees? And the second question is, I'm a smaller, maybe medium or small size enterprise. I own it entirely and I want to get out of it. And I don't necessarily have a child, an adult child, who wants to take it over. We can look over across the sea to Japan to actually see how this is playing out in real time, because most of Japan is small and medium enterprises. And because of their decline in birth rates, their aging population, and quite frankly, shrinking population, they've lost about 14 million people now since about 2014. It's a pretty sizable drop. There are just fewer people around to buy. So some of these businesses are not going to have the same value that they used to have unless they're super high performing. They might get purchased and merged into a larger enterprise. Sometimes, which is in the case of Japan, investment banks are coming in and scooping them up left and right. So there is hope for the industry and hope for people who would like to sell their business, but it might not be in that traditional way that they used to, where they simply sold their book.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about where we are in terms of fertility in the U.S.? Just
Sure.
Stepping back. Where are we headed? Because I know Japan is in not a happy situation in demographic terms.
Yep.
So it seems like a cautionary tale for the U.S.
Yeah, so when we do any kind of foresight planning for organizations, we look at 3 areas of demographic change. The first is birth rates and family creation. The second is the aging of the population. And the third is migration, and that is immigration, emigration, which I think is a very important point, and of course, internal migration, people moving from one city to another. On birth rates, though, basically, the United States birth rate has collapsed. We are down to 1.6 average babies per woman in this country. That is well below the 2.1 rate needed to maintain our population. So to put this in context here, without immigration right now, the United States would actually go into population reverse. So immigration is the only thing that's really propping up the United States as a growing country right now. If you look at countries that don't have a really positive outlook on immigration, China is a really phenomenal example of this. They lost about 2 to 3 million people last year alone because their birth rates are so categorically low. And when a population goes into reverse, everything changes. This idea of perennial growth that we are all accustomed to, it changes literally overnight. And the economy can go into, which is one of the worst words ever, stagflation, where prices remain stubbornly high, but wages remain relatively low. And Japan, in effect, has been in this period of stagflation for 2 to 3 decades now. And they're slipping on the overall GDP ranking worldwide as a result. What does that mean for investments? Well, it can mean a lot. The crystal ball isn't that perfect on what will happen here, but there are certainly industries that will be impacted. Housing is definitely one of those industries.
Talk about that, because housing is the basis of much of the average American's wealth, and it is what often is passed down to heirs. And if that sort of wealth mechanism is gone, it seems like that's a pretty fundamental change in our society.
Yeah, I mean, there's, like anything, there is risk and reward, and I think there's probably no better place in the country to have this conversation right now than here in southern Florida, where, you know, the entire condo industry is teetering on collapse. And there's good reason for it. We have had astronomical increases down here in insurance prices, averaging 70% increases over the past 5 years. And that's the average. That is just the average. If you're closer to the coast, it could be 100% or more. Because there was terrible governance, the governor, Ron DeSantis, put in place pretty stringent rules about condo management here. So you could be in a condo right now where, let's say you bought it 20 years ago for $200,000, you could have an assessment on that condo for $200,000. So rather than passing an inheritance with your real estate transfer, you might actually be passing a liability to your kids. You also might be wiping out, you know, that bit of wealth creation that you might want to cash out at the time of late retirement, when you might need something more specialized than a condo down here.
It's a little dire. Well, let's switch on to something else, a little more positive, maybe. Can you talk a little bit about your work with companies and how our companies are taking demographics into account when they're designing products and services?
Sure.
Innovative ways that they're going about strategizing for the future?
Yeah, I mean, companies are doing great stuff right now around it. They just don't like to talk about it because we tend to have a bias against older adults. We have a feeling of where they should sit in the world. And I think if any of you, many of you, all of you sell retirement products, we have this idea of what retirement looks like, and it typically looks like a couple walking along a beach like this or hitting the links at their local golf club, and that's not really what retirement looks like. It's not really what many older adults are behaving like anymore. And you probably see this with your clients every day. They are not your typical kind of picture of what an older adult is. So they're working longer, they're engaging longer, they are active consumers longer, they are more tech literate than they've ever been. And I think, you know, one of the coolest products is actually on my wrist, I imagine a number of your wrists as well, is the Apple Watch, where they've built a really inclusive product. And it's a product that takes into consideration a lot of disability and even, you know, some of the risks that are associated with old age. And I think back just 2 years ago, Apple ran this, I thought was a phenomenal ad, where I think it's called the Bob ad, and it pans onto an open forest, and it says in a very kind of computer voice, Bob has suffered a significant fall. He's located at X longitude, Y latitude. Please send help. We'll dial this number again. They had put Life Alert into the Apple Watch, and I think we're all old enough to remember, I've fallen and I can't get up.
That horrible gray fob.
That horrible fob that people wore around their neck. And believe it or not, just before walking over here this morning, that was on Morning Joe. Consumer Cellular has repackaged it and said, this is a great thing to sell again. People don't typically like to identify as old if they don't have to. They're looking for things that are integrated, and it's integrated into this product. So you're seeing more of that. Automotive has been one of the, I think, most advanced in considering the needs of a diverse population and integrating what older people want. How many of you have a car here? Most of you. How many of you have a car with a push-button start? The push-button start is effectively designed for people that have mobility impairments and can't turn over the ignition.
But you don't.
But let's be honest here. Like, think about how ridiculous it was that we had to get that little device into that little hole in a very dark space. So innovating with inclusion in mind is actually really, really important for the future. And because we are seeing these demographic shifts, because the younger population is declining, let me repeat, is declining and will likely continue to decline in the coming years, at least the next 20 years, we believe. You're going to have to look at a more diverse audience of people if you really want to sell your product. And that means building inclusion in. The same goes for your workplace. If you want a workplace that's going to survive the next 20 years, at least the next 20 years, you've got to look at hiring diverse age workers. And I know DEI is a bit of a boogeyman these days, but companies that tend to do these practices well really focus on the output, not the input. They're thriving. They're thriving more than other companies that don't.
You had a story about talking about sort of products. Was it? Oh, it was Porsche.
Yes.
Your father bought a sports car, and that led you down a little journey to find
a bit of a rabbit hole.
Okay.
Yeah, my father suffered a stroke about 5 years ago, and he was coming out of his rehab, did pretty well. And he says to me, I'm gonna get rid of my car. I'm gonna buy a new one. I said, oh, that's great. I said, what are you gonna get? He goes, a Porsche. Well, that's not the first car you think of for somebody who's had a pretty debilitating event. And I said, what do you mean a Porsche? He
Although
goes,
I might want to get that if it had a debilitating event. I might want to just live large.
yeah,
You know?
and that was effectively his answer. And then he added in this caveat, well, it's actually designed for people like me. And I said, wait, Porsche designed a car for people like you? And it turns out that they did. Porsche built this billion-dollar factory a number of years ago, and it was fully built around inclusion. Like, how was the car actually used by diverse populations? And he got this car, and this car was not just kind of a key component to living independently. This car gave him incredible confidence, and it was a huge part of his rehab as a process. And it's kind of wild to think that a car can do all of those things, but this is how the automotive industry, especially the German automotive industry, is really rethinking the world. Because Germany, Japan, Italy, these are obviously the Axis powers, they didn't have the same baby boom that we had here. So they aged faster than we did. So they've had to confront these issues a lot earlier than we've had to do. And as a result, you're seeing greater advances in these countries than we have here in terms of considering older adults and what they want.
So can we look to those countries to try to avoid their fate? I know demographics is a long-term issue, so it's hard to turn that ship around. But
well, it's nearly impossible to turn that ship around. And countries have tried time and time again to get the birth rates up. The birth rate is the only way to solve the immediate challenges. And for those of you who are parents here, you know it takes about 25 to 30 years to raise a fully functioning adult. So it's not like we can just snap our fingers and it all goes away. One of the core issues that really does seem to be at the heart of our low birth rates is the issue around affordable housing. And that's universal right now. So 40 years ago in 1985, I could have purchased a home within 2 years of saving, and I would have done so by the age of 29. Today in this country, it takes about 8 years to save for a home, and the average home buyer is now 38. So your industry is directly impacted by the affordability crisis right now because people are delaying how to get that money into the marketplace. And of course, they're delaying then how many kids they have, because if the average person is buying a home, starting a family at 38 now, 35 I think is the average age for marriage now, there's a short window to where you can have kids in that period. And some people are simply just saying, no, we're not going to have kids, or they've dramatically decreased the number of children that they're having. Overall, though, and again, this will go into your long-term planning with your clients, is that the birth rate has really collapsed most amongst women under the age of about 30 in this country. So that's anywhere from 16 and up. Where it's increased dramatically, in fact, it's the fastest growing group of mothers in this country are women over the age of 40. So all of this will have to be factored in, I think, to wealth planning in the future, and I'm not sure how many organizations have really kind of wrapped their head around this fundamental shift, where people are having kids now more likely in their 40s than their 20s.
You had mentioned to me some wild things that various countries were doing to try to increase the birth rate. I remember I read about one which was in Russia, if you had 3 children, the government would give you a car. I'm not sure that would really be enough for me, but what have countries tried to do? What can they really do?
They've tried everything, and we try it here too. We've got a child tax credit in this country.
Oh.
Some countries do direct payments to individuals to have babies. Other countries, particularly the Nordic countries, really focus on gender balancing the home, making sure that men and women have the same responsibilities, that they're rewarded effectively for having children at the same rate. In France, women who are having children, their jobs are protected universally. So there are a lot of these tools that people have tried, that these big countries have tried, but there are none of them in which they've actually turned the birth rate around. The places where the birth rate has turned around tend to be really small examples. There are a couple in Japan. There's a town in Nagi where the birth rate is nearly 3 now, which is astonishing. But they've really focused on the fundamentals of what it takes to have children. And it has to be a strong, tight-knit community with good services attached and affordable housing. And they are able to do it without sacrificing the role that women have achieved really over the past 100 years.
Isn't there some crazy Japanese town where the birth rate is so low and it was sort of depressing people that they built dolls and put them in the various...
Yeah. It's called the Valley of the Dolls.
Okay.
No take from the movie, by the way. Valley of the Dolls, and they just stopped having children there. The local employer went out. A handful of people stayed. This was a few years ago that I wrote this. But the average age of that population there, I think, is about 55 or 60 now. And it was so depressing that this one woman started knitting dolls that she put into the old classrooms of the school that had closed a decade ago.
I mean, that itself is so depressing to me, personally, but, I mean...
Yeah. But then, of course, you can find those places here in the U.S., too. And I think that's the important thing to take away, is that this kind of dystopian future of what could be, it does exist in parts of the United States as well. Like, you go to the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, that's the average age of the population there. And rural America is largely struggling. This doesn't mean that it's the end of the world. It just means that we're entering a new world. And it means that there are new risks that didn't exist before, and there are new opportunities that exist now that didn't before. So it's really not about gloom and doom. It's just about recentering for where the opportunity is and where to avoid the risk in the coming years.
But ageism is so entrenched in our society. It's just permeates a lot. So how as a society do we get beyond that? Because, if you're thinking of hiring older workers, I always think the knock against that is older workers like me would be more expensive. You know, healthcare, you know, my salary's gotten to a half-decent point. So you sort of feel like you have a target on your back because you cost more. So how do you encourage companies to hire older workers who are going to be more expensive?
I would unpack that a little bit because, you know, typically when companies do layoffs, in particular, and older people happen to be the first ones on the chopping block, they're not looking at your age. They're looking at the balance sheet and what you actually cost. So that's something that's just kind of the fundamentals of doing a reduction in force. When it comes to rehiring, though, there is a bit of a blinder on. And I think that most older workers that are looking for a job or have successfully gotten a job will tell you the one thing they hear most often is, you have too much experience. Well, in what world is that a problem? But employers tend to say that. Ageism is an issue. It is pervasive. I think what you're starting to see, though, now is because of these demographic shifts, because boomers control so much wealth, and because boomers have never allowed society to dictate their path, and this is from the moment they came out of the uterus, they have never let society dictate their path. They're saying to the world right now, we are not following the same playbook that our parents followed, that our grandparents followed. And where are you starting to see this pick up now? Well, you're starting to see it in product integration. How are products being delivered? You're starting to see it in marketing and communication strategies, how we're talking about older adults in this country. We're starting to see it in the way people are represented in media. And I think, you know, the real kind of harbinger of all of this is the way Hollywood overnight has really just accepted older adults as part of the thematic process. They're starring in films. There are true characterizations of what...
Frankie and Johnny, right?
Yeah,
Frankie
and Johnny, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there are all sorts of kinds of movies, television shows that are being made today about this. And, you know, the real kind of test case for this, again, was set down here in South Florida. The Golden Girls. Really
Classic.
the test case from the late 80s, early 90s, a show about 4 women who cohabitated to get together. Guess what we're starting to see massive trending around right now? People cohabiting together in later life. In fact, one of the most innovative seniors housing companies in the country is based just up the street here in Fort Lauderdale called Upside. And Upside works to place older adults together in market rate housing. It is the Golden Girls model. So despite the fact that there are all of these challenges that exist, there are incredible opportunities too. You just have to know where to look for them.
Yeah. And one thing you mentioned that I thought was interesting was that it was about using AI and the fact that AI can be ageist.
Oh, AI is incredibly ageist. And actually AI is riddled with bias. Like, riddled with bias. And I'm a big fan of AI. I use AI in my practice every day, whether it's crunching numbers, helping me give ideas for stories that I'm writing, fact-checking my work. I think AI is phenomenal, but AI is basically a warehouse, a large language model of everything we've produced as a people. So all of the bias that has shown up online, all of the bias that's ever been written, it's baked into AI. And I think that one of the funny things to do, and I encourage anyone to try it today, when you pick up your machine, is use a GPT, a DALL-E, and ask it to do basic things like, give me an image of a flight attendant. That flight attendant, 99.9% of the time, is going to be young, they are going to be female, and they're going to be some kind of ambiguous ethnicity. That is what the machine gives you. If you ask it to give you a pilot, 9 times out of 10, that pilot is going to be young, white, and wildly handsome. That is because we have been feeding the machine, we've been feeding this kind of bias into the system for so long that the machine accepts that as truth. So if we really want to be good stewards of what the future looks like, we have to unpack some of that bias. We actually have to push back on the artificial intelligence and say, actually, no, that's not what my clients look like. Actually, no, that's not what my community looks like. Oh, no, that's not what my actual workforce looks like. We have to tell it, we have to correct it, because it's not always right, despite it being a really amazing tool for us to use.
Interesting. I wanted to pivot to, as our time is wrapping up, what do you see, given the demographic trends, retirement looking like in 20 years or so? And is our whole concept of retirement at 65 Where did that come from? And is it
65 as a retirement age has been around for most of humanity, as long as civilization has been around. And some type of retirement product has always been offered, whether it's in the public space or the private space. In fact, in ancient Rome, if you served in the military, you received a pension upon retirement. So it's not really a new idea. What makes retirement relatively new as an idea, and I'm talking about 150 years old, is that in Germany, in the Weimar Republic, Otto von Bismarck said, we need to have a universal pension, and it needs to be an old age pension. And he set the number at 70. Super arbitrary, but when you look back at history, around 65 to 70 is when people tended to retire. Now, has it changed? Has retirement fundamentally changed? Yes and no. On one hand, there is universal access to a pension. We'll see how long that lasts.
Social Security?
Social Security.
Might be smaller in the future.
Maybe smaller. I mean, if we let it run out of money, the trust fund, I think most people will know this, average payments drop 25% immediately. Immediately. And this is across the board.
Yeah, I think they dropped by about 20%.
25%.
Yeah.
They drop immediately, no questions asked. It'll hit some people more than others, obviously, but that's just the reality of it. It's going to force people to work longer. And prior to the advent of the modern pension, people did work longer. People worked longer on average. Now, we can debate the fine points about whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, but people who tend to work longer tend to have better health outcomes, they tend to have better social engagement, they tend to be having greater mental health. All of these kind of, things flow from work, as much as we hate to admit it. And guess what? We have good data on this. It took about 20 years or so for the idea of retirement to really take on in this country. In 1946 to 1964, roughly during that period, about half of men over the age of 65 were in the workforce. Today, actually, I would say in the 90s, it dropped down to about 1 in 9. Today, it's about 1 in 4. So we are going back in many ways to a historic norm. Now, is it good or bad? We can debate the fine points on that, but it's happening. And this labor force that is now seeing some of their financial investments under threat, whether it be Social Security or a relatively rocky market right now.
Yes, I'm very happy to be talking about long-term trends now and not tariffs and stock market volatility.
Yes. But long-term, these folks really need to think differently about what their future looks like. For many older adults, for all of us, as we enter those quote-unquote retirement years, we actually might be thinking differently about work too. And work does not need to be a 9 to 5. It does not need to be 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week. The employers that are really going to win are going to figure out how to get people engaged in work even in part-time scenarios. And part-time scenarios tend to work best when companies are effectively forced into them. When they've got such a labor crunch, they have to think differently. And we're in that labor crunch. Technology is going to help us take some of that pressure off, but it's not going to be a full solution. Technology is going to be an excellent aid in moving us through this period, but people are too. And as I say about artificial intelligence and automation, they're wonderful, but I've never seen a machine buy a can of Coke, purchase a stock, or pay a cent in taxes. So we'll have to really address other challenges down the road too if we don't figure out a way to get revenue and engagement out of these machines as a result.
Well, if future work looks like this, I don't think I'd mind working
down
so
for
much
this.
longer.
I'm down for this.
Anyway, thank you so much for coming to hear this panel.
Thank you.
And have a great rest of your experience here.